Steam Deck, the most powerful gaming handheld in the world.
Can you say that again?
What is going on, everybody? Hope you're having a good week so far. So the ROG Ally has been out for more than 7 days, and for the past 24 hours, I have done about 10 hours of testing for the inevitable comparison between the ROG Ally and the Steam Deck. And I'm here to finally crunch up those numbers and tell you exactly what you can expect and how much more power you can expect from your ROG Ally, and exactly which games specifically perform better on the ROG Ally compared to the Steam Deck. And all of these instances were in turbo mode, portable. And another FYI, half of these tests were done while downloading something in the background, and my GPU settings were set to auto during half of the tests. Setting it back to 4 gigabytes improved performance greatly for specific titles. So just that small FYI, if games are working better or worse for you, which are on this list, it's most likely because your GPU VRAM settings were set differently than mine. So you might have to adjust accordingly. And also, every Steam Deck version of these games requires shader cache to increase performance and frame rate. So there were a good number of games that performed either the same or slightly better while the ROG Ally was in performance mode. And in total, I tested about 30 games and I knocked it down to 20 for this very video. And another funny thing, during the testing, the Steam Deck started to get extremely hot. So I had to apply the fan for longevity's sake. And while testing both, after 7 hours, the Steam Deck was the only handheld to crash while trying to play a specific title. So I guess that's 1 point for the ROG Ally stability. And the last thing I have to note, most if not all of these tests were done with the resolution set to 1080p and the graphic settings maxed out, just to push the handhelds to their limits and to get a good idea how far we can take them. So let's start this off with a bang. The first one is Marvel Spider-Man. Set at 1080p, at performance mode, it reached a frame count of 45 FPS. At 720p in performance mode, it went all the way up to 65 FPS. And I haven't seen those kind of numbers on the Steam Deck yet. Usually, Marvel Spider-Man will go up to 40 to even 45. So setting the ROG Ally's resolution to 1080p and getting 45 FPS was such a big relief. But here's where it gets crazy. Setting the game to turbo mode, you can get 65 to 80 FPS, and even higher if you switch on the dynamic resolution. And also, for some reason, the dynamic resolution on the ROG Ally looks so much better than it does on the Steam Deck. I just think it was made for 1080p. But even while docking the Steam Deck, you can see those strange digital lines around Spider-Man. But on the ROG Ally, I don't really notice any image degradation whatsoever. But let's move on to the next game. Next on the list is Quantum Break. I set it to 1080p and the frame count was 45 to 50 FPS. At 1080p, I didn't even think that was possible, but that's only possible with turbo mode. In performance mode, at 720p, the game somehow averaged 50 FPS. And I tried to set Quantum Break on the Steam Deck to 1080p and I only managed to get 30 to 35 FPS, which is not that far behind the ROG Ally's performance mode in 1080p, which was 40 FPS. So that was great. But the turbo mode numbers for the ROG Ally can't be beat. Now next up, I tested Power Rangers Battle for the Grid at 1080p in performance mode. The ROG Ally managed to push 60 FPS solid. And for some reason, this game just doesn't perform well on the Steam Deck. I'd hit 45 FPS, which started causing a lot of stuttering for some reason. So on the Steam Deck, the FPS kind of fluctuates, opposed to ROG Ally in performance mode, which is stuck at 60. And because of the lackluster performance on the Steam Deck, I just put the Nintendo Switch version on there for the longest time, but now I'm officially playing this game exclusively on the Ally. Number 4 is another great fighting game, Injustice 2. At 1080p, this game managed to perform at 60 FPS in performance mode. And the Steam Deck wasn't far behind at 1080p at 53 FPS average. So the ROG kind of pulls through slightly in performance mode, which is at the same TDP as the Steam Deck, if you want to hit those high frames at 1080p. Number 5 is Hellblade. At 1080p, I managed to get 30 FPS on very high settings, 40 FPS on high settings, and both times were in turbo mode. In performance mode, at 1080p, I managed to get 30 FPS on high settings. On the Steam Deck in 1080p, Hellblade really struggles. It kind of goes into the unplayable realm of 15 to 27 FPS, and that's kind of a little too low for me. Hellblade is a lot better in 720p on the Steam Deck and should just stay away from 1080p. Number 6 is, of course, Soul Calibur 6. At 1080p, the game reached 60 FPS in performance mode, and in max settings, in turbo mode, it reached 50 FPS. Not sure why max settings are so ridiculously demanding. I think it's because of the high resolution textures, just in case you're playing in 4K. Not sure. But the ROG Ally's temperature started to go up, close to where the Steam Deck was. And the Steam Deck at 1080p was also in 60 FPS. But on max settings, the FPS dropped all the way down to 44. So regardless of those minuscule 6 frames, ROG once again comes out on top because of its turbo mode. And number 7 is Tekken 7 at 1080p. In performance mode, the game hit 40 to 45 FPS. In turbo mode at 1080p, it reached the maximum frames of 60 FPS. But with the same settings, Steam Deck could only reach 29 to 35 FPS, which is unfortunate. And a lot of the times during fights, the game would run in slow motion, unfortunately. But yeah, with that extra boost with turbo mode, you can reach 60 FPS at 1080p, which is pretty much a console-like experience. Number 8 is Hotwheels Unleashed. At 1080p, ultra settings, in turbo mode, the Ally went up to 50 FPS. In performance, the frames went down to 40 FPS at 1080p. And on the Steam Deck at 1080p, the frames were at 35 FPS. Number 9 is Ultra Age. Now, this is where we start to see big differences in the compared performance between ROG Ally and the Steam Deck. At 1080p, the frames can vary from 50 to 90 FPS in performance mode. In turbo mode, max settings, the FPS was at a range of 70 to 120. And on the Steam Deck at 1080p, and for some reason, a lot of games that are trying to upscale to 1080p on the Steam Deck, if you're not putting the game in borderless windowed mode, for some reason, everything looks blurry. So I had to put the game in borderless windowed mode opposed to full screen that I had the ROG Ally in with Ultra Age. But at 1080p, the Steam Deck performed at a measly 28 to 45 FPS, depending what area you're in. But for the most part, it felt like it was going about 30 FPS. So for some reason, Ultra Age has a huge performance difference between the Ally and the SD. Now, number 10 is a game that I wanted to play on the Steam Deck for a very long time, and that is the OG Catherine. At 1080p, the game ran at a flawless 60 FPS performance mode, but on the Steam Deck at 1080p, if you managed to get this game to run, there were frequent stutters that kind of made it unplayable, especially since it's a puzzle-like game. But the FPS averaged out to 40 to 45, so not that bad, but nothing compared to the ROG Ally for some reason. But after getting past the first boss in Catherine, for some reason the game just infinitely loads or crashes and I have to do everything all over again. So for right now, the OG Catherine is still not supported on the Steam Deck. Don't know why. And number 11 is another game that is not quite supported that well. That's Resident Evil 6. At 1080p, I managed to get the game to run at 55 to 70 FPS in performance mode. In turbo mode, the game runs at 85 to 120 FPS. But here's the big difference. On the Steam Deck at 1080p, it runs at 45 to 65 FPS. Now, that doesn't sound too bad, but for some reason, the Steam Deck version has frequent stuttering, making the game nearly unplayable, at least for me in the past year when I've tried playing it. So the game would be running at, say, 60, then it would just jump down randomly to 45, or if it's playing at 40, it jumps down to about 20. And the stuttering happens all the time. But I believe Resident Evil 6 has been verified on the Steam Deck, and yet it's a stuttery mess. But on the ROG Ally, it can reach up to 120 FPS, and it has zero stuttering. So yeah, I highly recommend Resident Evil 6 on the ROG Ally over the Steam Deck. Definitely. And respectively, number 12 is Resident Evil 2 Remake. At 1080p, the game ran at 30 to 35 FPS in performance mode. In turbo, it went up to 45 to 55 FPS with VRR to boot. And all of this was possible under normal rendering methods, meaning I didn't change the render method to interlaced. I just tried normal mode, just to make the game look as good as it can and play as good as it can. Now, with the same exact settings, on the Steam Deck, the FPS fluctuated, could only reach 29 to 35 FPS, with frequent stuttering yet again, sometimes making the game nearly unplayable when you reach the point after running into Mr. X. At the beginning of the game, it's somewhat playable because you haven't run into all of the monsters yet, but the more overrun the RPD station becomes, the more stuttering you'll start to see and the lower the FPS will get. So usually what I did was lower the resolution to 900p, and for the most part the stuttering went away, except for the main hall and the RPD station. But on the ROG Ally, with the settings pretty much all the way up, Leon was able to stroll through the RPD station with almost zero stuttering or hitches, and that is a feat all on its own. Now going down the list, number 13 is the advertised Ghost Runner. At 1080p, the game managed to reach frames up to 40 to 52 in performance mode. But in turbo mode, which is really why you purchase an ROG Ally, Ghost Runner can perform up to 65 to 100 FPS at 1080p. And here's another point where the Steam Deck and the ROG Ally differ the most. At 1080p on the Steam Deck, Ghost Runner only reaches a performance of 20 to 27 FPS. So this game is vastly more playable on the ROG Ally at 1080p, which is a huge relief because there are a great deal of demanding sections in this game that require fast response time, and playing on the Steam Deck even at 720p, I wasn't able to reach the performance I wanted on it. And those type of games are the reason why I bought a Steam Deck, so I wouldn't have any limits, so I can reach 60 FPS without any kind of problems. But it seems like the ROG Ally is now fit for that purpose. And the next game on the list is a game I've been wanting to play on the Steam Deck since it came out. I chose this over Wanted Dead, and that game is Returnal. In performance mode, with the settings medium to low, it can reach frames up to 25 to 30 FPS, which isn't terrible, but this game requires more performance if you want to play it properly. In turbo mode, you can actually get 35 to 42 FPS on this game. Is the game playable? Not quite, but that is a big jump from the Steam Deck's 20 to 24 FPS in every constant moment. There are some segments that actually play very well on the ROG Ally, and I gotten pretty far. I actually beat a boss. So there's that. If you want to know how Returnal performs on the ROG Ally opposed to the Steam Deck, that's all you gotta know right there. Now, number 15 is a classic, and it was actually just announced for the Nintendo Switch. That is Batman Arkham City. I didn't think this game would give me trouble on the ROG Ally, but it kind of did. At 1080p, it ran at an average 50 to 60 FPS, which is kind of a big jump if you're trying to time a batarang or grapple onto a specific building that you're passing while gliding. But it reached that FPS mark in performance mode. In turbo mode, very strange that you would even go to turbo mode with a game like Arkham City, the FPS is pretty much locked to 60, and there's no chance that you'll see a dip in any area. On the Steam Deck, Arkham City performed at an average 45 to 60 FPS. So it's slightly worse, but the crux for me is the fact that Arkham City stutters a lot on the Steam Deck, especially when it's loading a new area, and I've had the game for quite some time. The stuttering has gotten a lot better over the course of the year and change, but it's still there on the Steam Deck. It's nice to see that it's absent on the ROG Ally, but there are some frame dips if you want to iron out the FPS, because for some reason Arkham City is still a demanding title, especially when you put the graphic settings all the way up at 1080p. So ironing out the FPS with turbo mode will get you the best experience you can have on a handheld with this game so far. Number 16 is JumpForce. At 1080p, it performed at 60 FPS in turbo mode. This game is another demanding title. In performance mode, it slowed down at 1080p, usually went from 45 to 50 FPS, and in some instances, it actually goes a little slow motion. But the fact that it can run at 1080p is still a great achievement. On the Steam Deck at 1080p, the game just runs at slow motion from 35 to 50 FPS, so it's pretty unplayable on the Steam Deck at 1080p. With lower settings, you can run JumpForce at 60 on the Steam Deck, but you'll pretty much be guaranteed 60 FPS 1080p if you're setting your Ally to turbo mode with this game. So number 17 is Batman Arkham Origins. At 1080p, the game performed at 50 to 70 FPS in performance mode. In turbo mode, it went from 60 to 80 FPS depending on what area you're in. On the Steam Deck, it was pretty similar, reaching 45 to 60 FPS, which ain't that bad. But for some reason with this Batman game as well, there's the occasional stuttering, which makes it a bit uncomfortable to play. And the stuttering on the ROG Ally with Batman Arkham Origins isn't there. So surprisingly, an older title like this is more playable on the Ally. Number 18 is Visage, or Visage, however you say it, or Visage. At 1080p, the game ran at 40 to 60 FPS in performance mode, 60 to 110 FPS in turbo mode. And on the Steam Deck with the same exact settings at the same resolution of 1080p, it went from 31 to about 45 FPS, depending on what room and part of the house or location you're in. Now this list is getting a little hot because number 19 is God of War. And I think this is pretty much what's going to sell ROG Ally if they advertise it correctly. At 1080p, full-scale resolution rendering, both the Steam Deck and the ROG Ally in performance mode ran at 20 to 22 FPS. They pretty much had no chance. It just requires too much power. But in turbo mode, at 1080p, the ROG Ally can reach frames up to 35 to 45 FPS. And that pretty much runs better than my older gaming laptop. And it's more than a 50% performance increase over the Steam Deck. This is where I saw the real difference between the two handhelds. That turbo mode is ROG Ally's secret sauce. It's also probably something that's going to blow up the system one day, but it is a bit overpowered when it comes to games like God of War that require even more wattage to handle everything that's going on. And moving on to the quintessential last game on the list, The Last of Us. I managed to get an impressive 35 to 40 FPS with the resolution set to a full 1080p. At 720p, the game actually ran at 45 to 50 FPS. This is groundbreaking, and the settings were actually set to medium. This game is verified on the Steam Deck, and at 720p, at the lowest settings, it runs at 25 to 30 FPS. It's clear with The Last of Us, it needs a lot of power for it to run properly on any system, and the ROG Ally has enough to boost it up to proper frames, which means running The Last of Us on the ROG Ally at performance mode gets you about 30 to 35 FPS, which is the same as the Steam Deck in its most optimal areas, but it still runs better than the Steam Deck does for the most part. And that's only if you set all of the settings to low, but setting it to medium, putting at 1080p in turbo mode, it gives you that sweet 35 to 40 FPS at 1080p, which is more than I could ask for with this title on this handheld. And this game proves the ROG Ally has so much more power than the Steam Deck, which barely ran the game at 30 FPS at 720p. While switching some settings to medium, there is some flexibility with the ROG Ally, surprisingly with The Last of Us, which is by far the worst optimized game this year for PC. And I'm so surprised that at 1080p this flexibility doesn't dissipate. It's still there, and with frames up to 40, that just blows my mind. And this draws the line and shows me that the ROG Ally is starting incredibly strong. With these comparisons, I hope that was enough to push some people to give the ROG Ally a chance and some time, because in its first week it was able to achieve all of this. It has proven that it's a juggernaut of a handheld, and the Steam Deck is a wonderful alternative. But that's exactly what it is to me now, an alternative to the ROG Ally, number 2, and now the new second place. But with that, I hope you guys enjoyed this list comparison video. It's a bit different from the stuff I usually do, but I had fun doing it nonetheless. And if you have any questions, let me know in the comments. I hope you guys have a good one. Later.